Today, we're diving into a really groundbreaking book by C. Riley Snorton called Black on Both Sides. It uncovers this incredible hidden history, arguing that you literally can't tell the story of trans identity without telling the history of Blackness. It's a huge idea, and it might just shift how you see things. So, let's get into it.
So to understand what's really at stake here, the book doesn't start way back in the past. Nope. It starts with a modern tragedy, a story that kind of frames this entire history. These are the words of Blake Brockington. He was a Black, transgender teenager from North Carolina. And in 2014, in a moment that should have been pure joy, he was crowned homecoming king. But that visibility, it came with a terrible price. The media spotlight opened the floodgates to this wave of online hate, a really vicious mix of racism and transphobia. The book uses this story to show us that this isn't some isolated incident. It's actually an echo of a long, painful history where these two things are deeply intertwined. Blake's story is really our doorway into the book's central argument. And it's an argument that's going to challenge us to completely rethink where trans history even begins.
So here's the core idea. The book argues that the very concept of transgender was shaped right from the beginning by the historical experience of Blackness. These are not two separate histories that just happen to cross paths sometimes. No, they are fundamentally woven together.
And to get this, we kind of have to tweak our definitions a little bit. The book reframes trans not just as an identity, but as a history of movement, of crossing lines of both gender and race. And Blackness is presented as more than a race. It's the very space, the condition that made this movement possible and often necessary.
Now, take a look at this image. It's a French postcard from around 1900, and it's basically the visual key to the book's title and its whole argument.
So what we're likely seeing here are performers doing the cakewalk, and this dance had this wild, layered history. It was Black performers imitating white minstrels who were in turn imitating Black people. It's this performance of movement, of literally walking the color line. It's a perfect illustration of that central idea, moving across these supposedly rigid lines of race and gender.
Okay, now let's dive into the archives. The book takes us to a really dark story of violence that, believe it or not, laid a foundation for modern medicine.
Let's talk about Dr. J. Marion Sims. In the history books, he's often celebrated as the father of modern gynecology, credited with all these amazing surgical innovations. But, and this is a huge but, his breakthroughs were built on an absolutely horrifying truth. They were developed through years of brutal, repetitive surgical experiments on enslaved Black women who had absolutely no say in the matter. The book makes a point to name the women whose bodies were used for this torture. Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, just to name a few. Anarcha alone had to endure 30 different experimental surgeries. And get this, all of these procedures were done without anesthesia, even though it was available at the time. I mean, Sims's own words are just chilling. After 29 failed surgeries on Anarcha, he wrote that her life was one where death would have been preferable. This is such a key moment. The book argues that this medical violence created a situation where Black bodies were just treated like objects, their gender and humanity totally erased for the sake of science. This is part of what Blackness means in the book, a condition that makes this kind of violation possible. But alongside this terrible history of violence, the book shows us an equally powerful story of resistance, of pure ingenuity, and of flight. So let me introduce you to Ellen and William Craft. In 1848, they set off on this incredibly daring 1,000-mile journey to escape slavery in Georgia. Their plan was just genius. Ellen, who had very light skin, disguised herself as Mr. Johnson, a rich, white, male slave owner who was traveling for medical care. And her husband, William, played the part of his loyal slave. Snorton calls this an act of ungendering. Now, this wasn't about identity in the way we talk about it today. It was a strategy. It was a performance designed to make them unrecognizable to a system that saw them only as property. By playing with the rules of both race and gender, the Crafts basically turned that ambiguity into an escape tool. This is a perfect example of trans as the book defines it, movement across lines as a way to survive and claim your freedom. And their story doesn't even end there. After they escaped, they became these amazing abolitionist speakers in England. And in 1851, at London's Great Exhibition, they staged this brilliant protest. So the big star of the exhibition was this famous sculpture, The Greek Slave, this idealized, beautiful white figure of suffering. The Crafts and their friends stood right in front of it and held up this satirical drawing, The Virginian Slave, forcing this huge international audience to see the brutal, racist reality of American slavery that the art was helping to hide. And Ellen Craft herself just laid out the connection between her freedom and her gender so powerfully. In this letter, she says she'd rather starve as a free woman in England than be a slave, an ungendered object, in America. For her, being a person, being a woman, and being free were all the same thing. Okay, so we have these two really powerful stories from the 1800s, one about medical violence, the other about escape and resistance. So what's the connection? How does this all loop back to Blake Brockington in the 21st century? Well, the book gives us this really unique way of looking at history. It says, hey, instead of a straight timeline, think of the past like a web of stories that are all connected. This means the stories of Sims's victims, the Crafts, and Blake Brockington aren't separate events. They're running alongside each other, echoing through time, and still shaping the world we live in right now. And that is why this history is so incredibly important today. You know, the fight against medical abuse and the use of gender fluidity as a tool for freedom, these aren't just things that happened a long time ago. They are part of the deep story that informs movements today, like Black Trans Lives Matter. This history shows us that the fight against anti-trans and anti-Black violence isn't some new alliance. It's a single struggle with very, very deep roots. In the end, the book leaves us with this really profound and challenging question to think about. It really pushes us to ask what it means when certain bodies have been forced to carry the weight of so much history, and how understanding that past is really the only way we can start to build a more just future.